It's always contested, and conflict is actually necessary and not necessarily bad. When a community is involved without looking at who's in that community, it can sometimes privilege people who have more access to their voice, to resources, and can leave out women and children, ethnic minorities, and the poor. And when we're talking about the city, it's really important to talk about space, whether it's public space or private space, because that's where social networks and social fabric, where resistance, where conflict, and new initiatives and new ideas, all of which are necessary for citizenship and for health, happen. Another way of thinking about our social context is how public spaces and services are essential to health and to well-being. So we know that to some extent we're born with our parents' genetic material, and that can help determine our health and our well-being. How old we are can help determine how healthy we are. But it's also really important to look at issues like what we're eating, how active we are, how much we're able to create a balance between our work and our life, how much we know people in our community and how much we trust people in our community, how much we're able to find jobs and the things that we need within our community, how much we're able to work and shop and move around our community, what our buildings and our local places are like. And all of that, of course, is in the context of a healthy city and a healthy globe. And that is within the context of climate stability and biodiversity. So really, we're part of an ever-expanding set of circles that determine our individual health and our well-being. Those kinds of spaces and services are sometimes called social infrastructure. And here's a definition of social infrastructure. It's facilities and services and networks that help individuals and families and groups and communities meet their needs, maximize their potential for development, and enhance their individual well-being and their community well-being. So you're seeing some themes emerge between social inclusion and social well-being and social infrastructure. And what that means is places to learn, like childcare centers, like schools, like tertiary education, libraries, adult literacy centers, museums, places to stay healthy, hospitals and health clinics, but also parks and open spaces and recreation centers, places that bring people together, like community gardens and parent-child drop-ins, and theaters and senior centers and laundromats, and even corner shops, and places to live, including emergency shelters and aged care and social housing. Quite often when we think about infrastructure, we think first of physical infrastructure. Things like transport systems and communication systems, and of course water and sanitation, like garbage collection and water lines and sewers. Energy infrastructure like electricity and gas lines. And generally that kind of infrastructure is created by engineers and has very strict rules and is very expensive. Social infrastructure is equally important, but it's usually a little bit less expensive to put in. It's not governed by as strict rules as some of the things that engineers do, and sometimes it's considered a little bit less essential than physical infrastructure, but it is just important. A school could be just important to a health and well-being in a water or a sewer line. Why is it important? Well, as we know, we live in a world of growing inequalities, and social infrastructure, like equal access to education and support and health services, can help reduce disadvantage. It can help individuals and families in stress by preventing unemployment, preventing violence, and preventing people feeling alone and being alone. It can provide a lot of jobs, and here's an example from my home country of Australia. Social infrastructure was the source of the biggest growth in the country of Australia between 2001 and 2011, double any other source of job growth. So it was more important than mining, it was more important than shops, it was more important than any other farming, any other source of employment. It created 500,000 jobs in a country of 22 million people. And interestingly, most of the jobs that were created were for women, particularly in childcare and aged care. And it's important to stress that the social infrastructure aren't just expensive things like schools and hospitals, but also good open spaces, specialized services, services that sometimes fall between easy funding holes. It's important to think about social infrastructure in cities and across all forms of habitat across the life course. So when you're a child, when you're a very young child, it's important to have maternal and child health nurses, to have childcare centers so that if your parents are working, there's a place for you to stay. It's important to have places, even if your parents are at home, one or more parents, to drop in with you. It's important to have a place to stay. And one good example from the Netherlands are schools that have all kinds of libraries and pools and even health centers within the school because people use the school as their community center. As you get a little bit older, it's still important to play. And to give another good example, Singapore enforces a range of apartment sizes in all of its buildings so that there is an age range in communities. And every block of buildings in Singapore is expected to have some form of a market or a cafe or a parquet, or in this picture, a playing field. And there's a certain range of social infrastructure, childcare facilities, games courts, playgrounds, that are expected for every group of 3 to 4 buildings that are linked by footpaths to schools and neighborhood centers so that everyone can get to those essential services easily and safely. As you become a young adult, your need for social infrastructure continues. You need health and social services, particularly in relation to mental health and employment, because young adulthood is a time of a great deal of stress, and violence prevention is quite often a very big issue for young women and young men. And it's really important to have cheap recreation and social opportunities, as is the case in Bogota, where every Sunday a lot of the streets are given over to underage music venue and Zumba in the park. As you get older and start working, it's really important to be able to get easily between your home and shops and works so that you aren't spending all your time trying to commute. And it continues to be important to get help and to continue to learn even after your formal education is ended. And that's especially important if you're a newcomer to the country. As you get still older, and in almost every country in the world, the proportion of older people is going up. It's not that different from earlier stages in your life. You still need to learn, you still need to look after your health, you still need to remain active. So things like community gardens, libraries, education centers, social centers, they're important even as you get older. Now let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted by the UN in 2015 and superseded the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in 2000. Like the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals have 15-year targets attached, so 2030, and it's intended to inform all the signatories, all the countries in the world, 173 right now, as well as international NGOs. The Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals covering climate action, gender equality, ending poverty, and reducing inequality. And goal 11 is around sustainable cities and communities. It's ironic that I'm talking about health, including making cities and settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The New Urban Agenda is part of the rollout of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the New Urban Agenda will be agreed upon at Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador in October. The The zero draft of the Sustainable Development Goals states that the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost in cities. And the fact is that 80% of wealth is generated in cities. But that's also where wealth inequalities are concentrated. Some of the key social inclusion issues are identified in the World Cities Report, which was recently published by UN Habitat. As we know, over 50% of the world's population lives in cities and towns as of 2007. And up to 2/3 of us will be living in cities and towns by 2050. In 1995, there were 14 megacities of 10 million plus. Now there are twice as many. We also know that there is a great deal more forced migration of refugees around the world and also an aging population. We also know that more decisions are being made at the local government level, but powers and money for local governments lag behind. Although there has been progress in informal settlements or slums, a lower proportion of the world lives in slums, but there are more people. And that leads to a very large physical and social infrastructure gap, 1 billion people being without private toilets. And of course, climate change will have a huge impact on cities, and cities will have a huge impact on climate change. Most of the world's largest cities are in low-lying coastal areas, and climate-related disasters are beginning to outnumber geophysical disasters. In these kinds of human-induced disasters, the poor are hit the hardest. Finally, there are increasing disparities between rich and poor, and part of the way that those disparities show themselves is in access to resources. So in the face of these challenges, what can planning and urban governance do? It's really important to plan for equitable access to essential infrastructure. There's a growing concept of complete communities where there's a variety of housing options, grocery shops and other commercial services, public schools, open spaces, recreational facilities, affordable transportation options, whether it's walking or cycling or using public transport, and amenities such as public squares and parks. It's really important that these complete communities be built at a walkable and bikeable human scale and meet the needs of all ages and abilities. And in order to achieve that, we need something called integrated planning, both at all levels of government, between local and state and national governments, but also across government, plus the private sector, plus NGOs, with funding prioritized to fill in gaps in low-income areas. I'm now going to give 2 examples of initiatives to try to plug those gaps. The Gender Inclusive Cities Project was a $1 million 3-year UN Trust Fund to Eliminate Violence Against Women project that ran from the beginning of 2009 to the end of 2011. Its goal was to enhance women's inclusion in the right to the city, and it was based on an understanding that creating safer and secure cities is a process of changing the nature of cities, who makes decisions, the way that they're thought of, the way they're designed, the way that they're planned. It worked in 4 cities in 4 different continents of widely varied size. All of them had previous experience in working between women's organizations and local governments on women's safety to develop and evaluate tools to integrate violence prevention into local policy and programs. It was based on partnerships, as many good initiatives are. The project was created by Women in Cities International, an action research network based in Montreal, Canada, that focuses on gender equality and the participation of women and girls in urban development. The project was managed out of Delhi, India, by a group called Jagori, that is a feminist organization that's been around for about 35 years. It also involved women's organizations in Russia, Tanzania, and in Argentina. The first question was gathering baseline information on the issue of violence and how it had an impact on everyday mobility and use of public space. There were street surveys carried out in all 4 cities in a variety of sites, low income and high income, but the emphasis was on low income districts. There were also a series of focus group discussions with older women, with lesbians, with counselors, local government officials, students, domestic workers, street sellers, people with visual disabilities, homeless people, journalists, young men, grassroots women's leaders, a tremendous variety of people. There were also local investigatory walks called women's safety audits to help identify specific unsafe places and how they can be improved. And finally, there was a review of policy, legislation, and initiatives in order to determine where each coalition could best and most efficiently intervene. In Delhi, that led to a series of interventions around urban planning and design, such as lighting and road design and public market design, and improving the safety of the University of Delhi's campus. But also a great deal of public awareness targeting different populations, education initiatives, and developing neighborhood safety committees. There was a lot of work on improving urban governance and service delivery, such as training with taxi drivers and subway staff, and partnerships to improve basic access to water and sanitation. And finally, of course, there was work with crime prevention and enforcement, improving police-community relations, provision of gender desks at the university and at police stations, and recommendations to improve programs with female police officers. The Delhi Transit Commission, or DTC, had women's safety in the bus sessions in part of their training curriculum, and that developed a pool of trained instructors and appointment of women conductors and drivers. There are awareness campaigns engaging the public and policies on sexual harassment in the workplace. Cab drivers were also involved in sessions on safety in public spaces. And there was public-facing mobilization campaigns involving women and men. An important aspect of the project was a logic model that moved between the problem, various activities that could address the problem, various initiatives and outcomes, and a notion of the impact over the 18 months of the project. At the end of the project, the 4 cities got together and talked about what they'd learned. It was really important that this grassroots initiative be seen as research, not only community development. So analyzing the data that was created by grassroots women that created effective interventions using the right to the city approach that asserted that everyone had an equal right to public space and to decision-making around public space. Policy analysis became seen as an empowerment tool. So the notion of empowering women, girls, and other stakeholders through increasing public awareness of the issue of violence in public space, and engaging women at the neighborhood level to take leadership and advocate for policy changes in their neighborhood and at the city level, and using media. This created a strong support base for organizations within local politics. The evaluation itself was seen as an empowerment tool. So asking the question from the first, what kind of difference are we trying to make and how will we measure it? It was a bit too early to measure impact on incidents of violence itself, but you can measure changes in terms of use of public space and in terms of comfort in public space, and that made the work stronger. And peer-to-peer knowledge exchange was terribly important, so creating mutual support between community-based women's organizations globally, using the internet as we are today, using face-to-face meetings, and helping develop an international community of practice. And one particular point of pride was that the investigators who started the project were in their 40s, but it was left in the hands of women in their 20s. The second example that I'll be giving today takes place in the country of Papua New Guinea, and it was asking the question, how can people with disability influence decision-making around road development in that country? The project partners included a partnership at the University of Melbourne on disability inclusive development, a large private sector organization called Cardno, the Papua New Guinea Assembly of Disabled Persons, a local university in PNG called Divine Word, and it was funded through the Australian Development Research Awards. As is the case in other parts of the world, 10 to 15% of the population are people with some form of impairment. The most common impairments are movement, seeing, and hearing impairment. And in this picture, you see 2 women signing and 1 woman in a wheelchair. There's also a man who's sight impaired. The common causes are disease, accidents, and aging. Some people in Papua New Guinea still feel that disability is caused by supernatural agents. And violence and ethnic clashes and road accidents are also common causes of disability. Roads are absolutely necessary in order to access essential services like schools and healthcare and markets. However, roads can also become a cause of disability and can exacerbate the marginalization not only of people with disability, but children, older people, and anyone who has some form of impairment. So, for instance, in Nairobi, Kenya, a road evaluation of pedestrian crossing observations found that older and disabled people often look stressed crossing the street when there were inadequate crossings, in contrast to other adults using the crossing. Road infrastructure planning is mostly led by governments, but community participation can improve the results. In India, village councils prioritize roads for improvements, and community members led walkabouts with engineers to prioritize improvements to those roads. In Tanzania and Uganda, group discussions between councils, engineers, and community representatives again help prioritize roads for improvements and improvements in roads. The principles of the Disability Inclusive Road Development Project were full participation of people with disabilities in every phase, accessibility of the materials, developing the capacity of individuals and organizations, including all groups of people with disabilities, and creating long-lasting partnerships. The research was led by people with disability who undertook interviews with local road decision makers, discussions with other people with disabilities, walkabouts or safety audits, which we call moveabouts, poster making in order to create a visual record of some of the problems and concerns, and all materials were written in very simple language. The outcomes of the project included guidelines to support inclusive consultation for use by the Papua New Guinea government, the Australian Aid Organization, the World Bank, and private infrastructure consultants. The work influenced the National Transport Plan of 2013 and a training package for disabled people's organizations to work with road decision makers, which has been used around the world. The learnings from the project were that low-cost data collection tools, similar to those used in gender-inclusive cities, were effective as lobbying tools with local and senior government. But in contrast with the Gender Inclusive Cities project, where many of the workers had university background, only 2 of the Papua New Guinea researchers had university qualifications. Most had grade 10 qualifications, but all were able to analyze results and create advocacy plans. I'll end by speaking about the next steps. Habitat 3 will be adopting a new urban agenda in October of 2016. So the question becomes, how can researchers work with NGOs, non-government organizations, local governments, grassroots organizations, and the private sector to improve access to services and enhance greater social inclusion? How can we all work in local, regional, and international partnerships for peer learning? I would suggest that the use of low-cost tools can be extremely effective. The partnerships between government, private sector, and community organizations can be a very effective mechanism. That using local expertise is very important, and that following the money and looking at the potential for partnerships in creating infrastructure like roads or improving public spaces such as universities and transit systems can be very effective. Although there are huge wealth and power disparities, social inclusion can make a difference. Cities can be places of opportunity and positive encounter. And the photo on the top are a group of children reclaiming the night in Japan. People can appropriate public space both through formal and informal activities, like dancing in public space, that's the case in the picture below, but also through activism, and that's essential to the right to the city. It is impossible and undesirable to divide objective measures, such as reported crime statistics, from the perceptual and subjective social lens through which we view the city. And every single person, whether they be a child, whether they be a person with an intellectual or physical impairment, whether they be a woman, whether they be an older person or a younger person, everyone has the potential to exercise the right to the city. The questions that I would like you to think about at the end of this seminar are, how can the citizenship capacity of children, women, newcomers to the country or the city, people with disability, older people, be mobilized towards more democratic decision making? How can the distribution of social infrastructure assist in addressing income disparities? In what ways can inevitable conflicts over the distribution of infrastructure be most fairly addressed? How can local governments and the private sector work specifically with grassroots groups to improve safety? And how can local governments and the private sector work specifically with disability groups to improve universal access? Thank you for listening today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, we would like to thank you for sharing your expertise and your contribution to the ongoing discussions on Habitat 3. We know you are real, and we thank you very much for your participation. Now to our attendees, a short survey will appear on your screen at this moment. Please, if you can just answer it briefly before we begin the Q&A. It's a small question, yes or no. Please, if you can just vote for that, and then we will begin the Q&A section. Okay, perfect. So everyone has already answered the question. So we will begin with the Q&A. First, we will begin with a question for Carolyn. They say, what are the biggest challenges that come along while implementing inclusive cities?
Ooh, that's a big challenge to answer. I think that the biggest challenge for cities, and one that I'm sure is going to be addressed at Habitat 3, is that the local level of government is the level that's closest to people's lives. And so it's really important that that level of government have really qualified people but also access to resources. More and more decisions are being put at the local level of government, but they have very little access to resources. Generally, national governments have obtained the majority of taxes, and also national governments retain the majority of powers. So local governments sometimes don't have the legal powers, for instance, to regularize informal settlements. So I would say that the biggest challenge facing us in sustainable cities is giving more powers to cities and city regions in order to make the right equitable decisions.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, for your answer. We have another question from Vanessa Guerra. She asks, do you have any advices on how to improve communication between local and national governments and the private sector?
Well, that does speak to the challenge that I was just mentioning, which is that certainly national governments have to give citizenship rights to the cities themselves. In many cases, cities don't have constitutional basis to make decisions. And so national governments need to realize that urban areas are often where wealth is concentrated and where a nation's health is concentrated, and need to give local governments appropriate powers. As for private organizations like civil society can be very valuable partners at the local level, and then the challenge becomes how to create ongoing mechanisms, ongoing partnerships between local businesses, charitable and community organizations, and local governments in order to make effective change.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn. We have one more question, if that's okay, from Shani Pereira. In order to achieve 2030, how important is it to incorporate the facilitator of faith-based institutions or programs around the world to constitute social infrastructure?
Well, what's happening in a lot of countries around the world is that international NGOs, in a way, are hopscotching over national governments and creating local partnerships. It's really important to, on the one hand, work with these international organizations that often have expertise in more than one country and may be able to bring about learnings from one place to another place. But on the other hand, these international NGOs don't necessarily have a democratic basis, so it's really important to include local governments and citizens of local areas in these decisions as well. NGOs can be incredibly effective, they can be incredibly important, but they're not necessarily based in a democratic process. So it's a balance between local democracy and working with international NGOs.
Thank you, Carolyn. If it's okay with you, we just got 2 more questions.
Yes, that's fine with me.
Okay, perfect. So Ernesto Rodriguez asks how the governance of private sectors and NGOs are going to face disasters such as the earthquake when planning the cities or the continuing to build the cities.
Yes, I think that there's a growing understanding of the importance of being able to respond to disasters, and there's sort of a continuum of disasters. There's disasters that happen all the time, and then there's a growing number of disasters that are either affected by climate change or are human-induced disasters such as wars. There is a limit to which you can plan for these kinds of disasters, then the question becomes, how can you start the mending process after disasters? And really the most important thing I think that you can do in order to create resilient cities that can respond to disasters is to have strong partnerships in place so that when disasters occur, you already have a basis of trust and people knowing one another in order to respond rapidly to any emergency, whether it be an earthquake or a tsunami or civil unrest.
Thank you, Carolyn. We have another question from Fernando Puente. He says, how would you think international cooperation could help southern countries to improve people empowerment in order to access to social infrastructure?
That's a big question. And I think that one of the first things to keep in mind, and I've seen this in the 20 years I've been working on this kind of work, is that even 20 years ago, we were talking very much about north-south dissemination. And right now, I strongly feel that the best ideas in the world are coming from countries of the global south. So it's really important both that countries of the global south are able to exchange ideas, but also that countries of the global north sort of think humbly about what they have to learn from places that often have greater challenges and fewer resources, but are able to make more meaningful change. I'll give two examples. The first example is participatory budgeting, which of course came out of Brazil in a post-dictatorship situation, and now informs the way that we think about participatory democracy all over the world. A second example is the kind of intensive bus networks, that particular form of infrastructure that has happened first in Curitiba and Bogota, and now is spreading around the world. So I think that it's really important that countries of the south be able to learn from one another, and also that countries of the north be open to learning from countries from the south about what is working best, because quite often the best ideas are coming out of the world majority, which is the countries of the global south.
Thank you, Carolyn. We have a lot of questions coming in, but because of time constraint, we are going to limit it to one or two more maybe. We have one from Maria Gabriela Molina. How can inclusive policies in cities can impulse the city's growth?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, how can inclusive policies in cities can impulse or promote the city's growth?
The city's goals.
Growth, sorry.
Sorry, what is the last word?
Growth? Growth, as in growing of the city?
Yeah.
Yes,
well, I think that the classic situation is that you don't know who the next person who's going to make a great scientific breakthrough is. So in order to offer educational opportunities to all and health opportunities to all, it's a very economically smart idea, because the next new idea may come from somebody who has a chance because of education or because of social services that otherwise they wouldn't have. Certainly, whether it's new businesses or new artistic expression, we find more and more that some of the most exciting ideas are coming from people who have traditionally been marginalized. And that includes, of course, not just women, people with disabilities, sometimes older people, sometimes very young people have really amazing ideas that will change the world. So you need to, in order to be open for that, you need to make sure that every place has a library, every place has a good public school, because that's going to engender the next generation of great ideas that will change the world and add to social and environmental growth as well as economic growth.
Thank you, Carolyn. With that, we can end the Q&A section. On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, we would like to thank you, Carolyn, and thank everybody for attending this webinar on inclusive cities and the new urban agenda. After the webinar closes, a window will open up on your screen with a short questionnaire, which will also be sent to you by mail tomorrow. Please, if you can fill it out to receive the certificate of participation. Also, on your screen, you can see our social media. We invite you to follow us and visit our webpage. Also, we just wanted to remind you that tomorrow we have another seminar on social cohesion, equitable cities, and the right to the city, given at 11 a.m. Ecuador time, GMT-5, given in Spanish by Dr. Gustavo Duran, PhD in Architecture and Urban Studies. You can register at our webpage where you registered for this webinar. Thank you and good evening.